Welcome back, guys, to another historical story. Hit the subscribe button. Let's start. Roosevelt collaborated with and was a friend of his commander, the hard-fighting, hard-drinking Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen Sr. Their unorthodox approach to warfare did not escape the attention of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the 7th Army commander in Sicily, and formerly the II Corps commander. Patton disapproved of such officers who dressed down and were seldom seen in regulation field uniforms, and who placed little value in Patton's spit-shined ways in the field. Patton thought them both unsoldierly for it and wasted no opportunity to send derogatory reports on Allen to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean Theater of Operations, MTO. Roosevelt was also treated by Patton as guilty by association for his friendship and collaboration with the highly unorthodox Allen. When Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Division and reassigned, so was Roosevelt. After criticizing Allen in his diary on July 31, 1943, Patton noted that he had asked permission of Eisenhower to relieve both Allen and Roosevelt on the same terms, on the theory of rotation of command, and added, concerning Roosevelt, "There will be a kick over Teddy, but he has to go, brave, but otherwise, no soldier." Later, however, upon hearing of the death of Roosevelt, Patton wrote in his diary that Roosevelt was one of the bravest men I've ever known, and a few days later served as a pallbearer at his funeral. Roosevelt was also criticized by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, the II Corps commander, who ultimately relieved both Roosevelt and Allen in both of his autobiographies, A Soldier's Story, 1951, and A General's Life. Bradley claimed that relieving the two generals was one of his most unpleasant duties of the war. Bradley felt that Allen and Roosevelt were guilty of loving their division too much, and that their relationship with their soldiers was having a generally bad effect on the discipline of both the commanders and the men of the division. Roosevelt was assistant commander of the 1st Infantry Division at Gela during the Allied invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky. 30, commanded Allied forces in Sardinia and fought on the Italian mainland. He was the chief liaison officer to the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy for General Eisenhower, and repeatedly made requests of Eisenhower for combat command. In February 1944, Roosevelt was assigned to England to help lead the Normandy invasion and appointed deputy division commander of the 4th Infantry Division. After several verbal requests to the division's commanding general, C.G. Major General Raymond Tubby Barton, to go ashore on D-Day with the division were denied, Roosevelt sent a written petition. The force and skill with which the first elements hit the beach and proceed may determine the ultimate success of the operation. With troops engaged for the first time, the behavior pattern of all is apt to be set by those first engagements. It is considered that accurate information of the existing situation should be available for each succeeding element as it lands. You should have, when you get to shore, an overall picture in which you can place confidence. I believe I can contribute materially on all of the above by going in with the assault companies. Furthermore, I personally know both officers and men of these advance units and believe that it will steady them to know that I am with them. Barton approved Roosevelt's written request with much misgiving, stating that he did not expect Roosevelt to return alive. Roosevelt was the only general on D-Day to land by sea with the first wave of troops. At 56, he was the oldest man in the invasion, and the only one whose son also landed that day. Captain Quentin Roosevelt, too, was among the first wave of soldiers at Omaha Beach. Brigadier General Roosevelt was one of the first soldiers, along with Captain Leonard T. Schroeder, Jr., off his landing craft as he led the 8th Infantry Regiment and 70th Tank Battalion landing at Utah Beach. Roosevelt was soon informed that the landing craft had drifted south of their objective, and the first wave of men was a mile off course. Walking with the aid of a cane and carrying a pistol, he personally made a reconnaissance of the area immediately to the rear of the beach to locate the causeways that were to be used for the advance inland. He returned to the point of landing and contacted the commanders of the two battalions, Lieutenant Colonels Conrad C. Simmons and Carlton O. McNeely, and coordinated the attack on the enemy positions confronting them. Opting to fight from where they had landed rather than trying to move to their assigned positions, Roosevelt's famous words were, "We'll start the war from right here." These impromptu plans worked with complete success and little confusion. With artillery landing close by, each follow-on regiment was personally welcomed on the beach by a cool, calm, and collected Roosevelt, who inspired all with humor and confidence, reciting poetry and telling anecdotes of his father to steady the nerves of his men. Roosevelt pointed almost every regiment to its changed objective. Sometimes he worked under fire as a self-appointed traffic cop, untangling traffic jams of trucks and tanks all struggling to get inland and off the beach. 37. One GI later reported that seeing the general walking around, apparently unaffected by the enemy fire, even when clods of earth fell down on him, gave him the courage to get on with the job, saying if the general is like that it cannot be that bad. When Major General Barton, the commander of the 4th Infantry Division, came ashore, he met Roosevelt not far from the beach. He later wrote, "While I was mentally framing orders, Ted Roosevelt came up. He had landed with the first wave, had put my troops across the beach, and had a perfect picture, just as Roosevelt had earlier promised if allowed to go ashore with the first wave, of the entire situation. I loved Ted. When I finally agreed to his landing with the first wave, I felt sure he would be killed. When I had bade him goodbye, I never expected to see him alive. You can imagine then the emotion with which I greeted him when he came out to meet me, near La Grande Dune. He was bursting with information. By modifying his division's original plan on the beach, Roosevelt enabled its troops to achieve their mission objectives by coming ashore and attacking north behind the beach toward its original objective. Years later, Omar Bradley was asked to name the single most heroic action he had ever seen in combat. He replied, "Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach." Following the landing, Roosevelt utilized a jeep named Rough Rider, which was the nickname of his father's regiment raised during the Spanish-American War. Before his death, Roosevelt was appointed as military governor of Cherbourg. Roosevelt's soldier and general journey was very bravery. All generals respected him. Throughout World War II, Roosevelt suffered from health problems. He had arthritis, mostly from old World War I injuries, and walked with a cane. He also had heart trouble, which he kept secret from Army doctors and his superiors. On July 12, 1944, a little over 1 month after the landing at Utah Beach, Roosevelt died of a heart attack in France. He was living at the time in a converted sleeping truck, captured a few days before from the Germans. He had spent part of the day in a long conversation with his son, Captain Quentin Roosevelt II, who had also landed at Normandy on D-Day. He was stricken at about 10 p.m., attended by medical help, and died at about midnight. He was 56 years old. On the day of his death, he had been selected by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, now commanding the U.S. First Army, for promotion to the 2-star rank of Major General and command of the 90th Infantry Division. These recommendations were sent to General Eisenhower, now the supreme Allied commander in Europe. Eisenhower approved the assignment, but Roosevelt died before the battlefield promotion. Of his death, Patton wrote, "Teddy R. Roosevelt died in his sleep last night. He had made 3 landings with the leading wave, such as fate. He was one of the bravest men I ever knew." Roosevelt was initially buried at St. Miraglise. Photographs show that his honorary pallbearers were generals, including Omar N. Bradley, George S. Patton, Raymond O. Barton, Clarence R. Hubner, Courtney Hicks Hodges, and J. Lawton Collins, the 7 Corps commander. Later, Roosevelt was buried at the American Cemetery in Normandy, initially created for the Americans killed in Normandy during the invasion. His younger brother, 2nd Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt, had been killed in action as a pilot in France during World War I and was initially buried near where he had been shot down in that war. In 1955, his family had his body exhumed and moved to the Normandy Cemetery, where he was reinterred beside his brother. Ted also has a cenotaph near the grave of his parents at Young's Memorial Cemetery in Oyster Bay, while Quentin's original gravestone was moved to Sagamore Hill. Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s grave marker at the American World War II Cemetery in Normandy. He lies buried next to his brother, Quentin, who was killed during World War I. General officers including Omar Bradley and General J. Lawton Collins, with goggles, attending Roosevelt's funeral. General Clarence Hubner is visible behind Bradley, and George Patton is partially visible behind Collins. Roosevelt was originally recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross by General Barton. The recommendation was upgraded at higher headquarters to the Medal of Honor, which was approved, and which Roosevelt was posthumously awarded on September 21, 1944. Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., and his father, Theodore Roosevelt, remain one of only two father-slash-son duos to receive the Medal of Honor, the other pair being Arthur and Douglas MacArthur. Roosevelt was also one of two sons of presidents of the United States to be awarded the Medal of Honor, the other being Webb Hayes. The fathers of both men were deceased and had been out of office for several years during their sons' Medal of Honor actions, so nepotism and politics were not likely a factor in their awards. For gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty on June 6, 1944, in France. After two verbal requests to accompany the leading assault elements in the Normandy invasion had been denied, Brig General Roosevelt's written request for this mission was approved, and he landed with the first wave of the forces assaulting the enemy-held beaches. He repeatedly led groups from the beach, over the seawall, and established them inland. His valor, courage, and presence in the very front of the attack, and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice. Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, Brig General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directed and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strong points and rapidly moved inland with minimum casualties. He thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. If you like, please guys hit the bell icon for more.